Every season, one corner of Eli Parker's farm refused to grow. Crops withered, soil stayed barren, and neighbors whispered of curses. When Eli finally dug deeper, his shovel struck something that should never been there. A rusted panel, a hollow echo beneath the ground, and crates marked with symbols no one could read. Then, in the dead of night, trucks arrived, floodlights lit the field, and everything hidden was taken away without explanation. What secret lay buried under his land? And why was it removed under silence and watchful eyes? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The land stretched out in neat rows, green blades reaching skyward, bending slightly in the breeze that rolled across the Ohio Valley. Eli Parker leaned on his shovel at the edge of the field and looked across the expanse with a farmer's quiet satisfaction. Corn was rising steady and straight, the kind of growth that promised a good harvest if the rains came when they should and the sun held back its fury. Yet his eyes always returned to the far corner, a patch no larger than a small barn, where nothing seemed to take. That corner had been the same since his father's time and his father's father before that. No matter what was planted, the ground there turned stubborn. Seedlings sprouted weak, their leaves paling far sooner than the others, as though life itself refused to settle in. Corn stalks would yellow and fall. Soybeans curled up before they could spread their leaves. Wheat stayed brittle, never reaching for the sky. Each year, Eli tried again, hopeful that maybe this time the soil would forgive whatever history lay buried beneath. And each year, he watched it fail. He had tried everything a man could think of. Fertilizer mixed carefully, lime spread in precise amounts, new drainage ditches cut to keep water from pooling. He tilled it deeper, turned it earlier, rotated crop season after season. Nothing mattered. The patch always betrayed him, standing out like a scar against the thriving acres around it. Neighbors had noticed, too. They asked him about it at the feed store or while leaning on their truck beds after church. Voices low as though the ground itself might overhear. Some said it was bad luck. Others muttered about chemicals dumped long ago when the old factory still worked steel down by the river. A few suggested things they wouldn't say too loud. Talk of curses, or land remembering things men had forgotten. Eli didn't put much stock in curses. He was a man who believed in sweat, in sun and rain, in the ledger lines that marked each season's yield. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling whenever he walked across that patch. The ground felt different underfoot, softer in places, harder in others, as if it shifted with each step. He noticed how birds never lingered there, how the air seemed still even when wind rippled through the rest of the field. It was only a corner, but it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Sometimes in the evening, when the light dropped low and the land turned gold, he stood at the fence and looked at it, wishing he could turn his eyes elsewhere. His father's old ledger sat on a shelf inside, a reminder that this problem was older than him. Scribbled notes, barely legible now, recorded the same complaint. North patch won't take. His father had circled the words, maybe in frustration, maybe in warning. Eli traced that circle once with his thumb and felt the weight of inheritance settle heavy in his chest. The rest of the farm thrived, but that one spot remained stubborn year after year, season after season. And though Eli told himself he could ignore it, that a farmer always had losses and some land just wasn't worth fighting, he knew his bones that sooner or later he would have to dig deeper. Something beneath that soil was holding on, and it wasn't going to let go. The feed store smelled of grain dust and coffee, the kind of scent that clung to boots and coats long after a man had left. Eli Parker stood near the counter, hat in hand, waiting on his order of seed mix and mineral supplement. The place was always a gathering spot, especially on late mornings when the fields were too damp to work or when men just wanted to exchange news under the pretense of buying something small. Today, as soon as Eli walked in, the talk seemed to shift, voices lowering but not low enough to hide what was being said. He didn't need to strain to hear. They were talking about him, or more precisely, about the corner of his land where nothing would grow. Old Henry Wilkes leaned back against a bin of chicken feed, arms folded across his chest, telling anyone who'd listened that bad drainage was to blame. He said the soil that was compacted, the water sat too long, roots rotted before they had a chance to stretch. Across from him, Amos Turner shook his head. He claimed it wasn't water at all, but something buried deep down, something left behind from when the steel plant dumped waste into the river valleys. He remembered trucks rumbling out past the farms in the middle of the night, back when no one asked too many questions. Others had stranger notions. A couple of younger men, leaning on their coffee cups, said maybe the ground was cursed. They told stories about land remembering things, about old feuds that ended in blood, about barns that had burned and never been rebuilt. One swore he'd seen a dog refuse to walk across that patch, tail tucked, ears flat, as if it sensed something no human could. The others laughed, but the kind of laughter that covered unease, not amusement. Even in the daylight, in the safety of a store full of people, they spoke of that field like it carried a shadow. Eli stood with his order slip in his hand, silent as he always was when gossip circled around him. He had long ago learned that silence carried more weight than words. Still, he could feel their eyes on him, sliding across his shoulders, waiting to see if he'd defend his land or admit defeat. He gave them nothing. He let them fill the air with their theories while he stared at the scuffed wooden floor, listening to the murmur of voices that fell heavier than the sacks of feed stacked against the wall. The truth was, he didn't have an answer either. He'd tried fixing drainage, he'd tested the soil, he'd poured sweat into that corner until his back ached. Nothing worked, and though he told himself the men's whispers didn't matter, he carried them with him when he left, tucked in his chest like a stone. It wasn't just a bad patch of ground anymore. It was a story other people told, and in small towns, stories stuck longer than the seasons. He loaded the bags into his truck bed, each one thudding against the metal with a dull finality. Behind him the voices carried on, low and steady, as though they had always been there and always would be. He drove away without a word, but their whispers rolled with him, louder in the silence than they had been inside the store. The patch in his field had become more than stubborn soil. It was a weight he couldn't set down, a question that would not leave him alone. The ledger was older than Eli, bound in cracked leather that had softened with years of handling. Its corners curled inward like leaves left too long in the sun, and the pages bore the faint smell of oil lamps and tobacco that clung to everything his father once touched. Eli kept on a high shelf in the kitchen, not because he needed it for planning anymore, but because it felt wrong to throw it aside. Some nights, when the house was too quiet and the walls carried the echoes of work long done, he would take it down and let his father's handwriting speak across the years. The entries were plain, stripped of sentiment, just rows of figures, dates, and notes scribbled in a steady hand. Rainfall totals measured in inches, yield counts penciled in columns, cost for seed, fertilizer, diesel fuel. His father had believed that numbers told the truth, that land was a ledger as much as a field, and if you read it carefully enough, you'd find a pattern. Eli had inherited that same instinct, but when he came to the page marked with his father's warning, the pattern broke. North patch won't take. The words were circled in graphite, pressed so hard the paper had dented, as though his father's frustration had driven the pencil deeper than it should. Eli traced a mark with his thumb, the indentation catching against the skin. It wasn't the only time the words appeared. Flipping back through earlier seasons, he found the same line repeated, sometimes scribbled at the margins, sometimes placed squarely at the end of calculation, as though it were the only conclusion that mattered. Always the same patch, always the same failure. Eli sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread before him, the late afternoon light falling across the page. He could almost see his father there, hunched over the same table, glasses perched on his nose, the steady scratch of pencil filling the quiet after supper. His father had never spoken much about the land's mysteries. He'd just worked it, season after season, fighting the battles he could and enduring the ones he couldn't win. Maybe he believed the patch wasn't worth mentioning, that some problems belonged to the soil alone. Or maybe he'd chosen silence because he knew no explanation would ever satisfy. The thought weighed on Eli more than he wanted to admit. He had grown up watching his father battle weather, debt, and exhaustion, always carrying himself with a kind of endurance that refused complaint. To see those 4 words in the ledger, repeated and circled, felt like stepping into his father's hidden frustration, a glimpse behind the quiet strength. It wasn't just Eli's problem. It had been his father's burden too, and maybe his grandfather's before him. The rest of the farm produced well enough, But that corner remained a scar passed from one generation to the next, resistant to all effort. Sitting with the ledger open, Eli realized the land was telling him the same story it had told his father. Something was wrong beneath the soil, something no plow or fertilizer could mend. The page seemed to hold its silence like the field itself, daring him to dig deeper, to do what his father had never done. Outside, the wind carried dust across the yard, rattling against the window pane. Eli closed the ledger gently, almost reverently, as though disturbing it further might release more than he was ready to face. The words lingered in his mind long after he set it back on the shelf. North Patch won't take. His father had accepted it. Eli knew he could not. The county truck pulled into the drive on a Tuesday morning, its white paint dulled by dust from back roads and its seal half faded on the door. 2 agents stepped out, clipboards in hand, their boots already carrying the marks of other farms. Eli greeted them with a nod, his hat pulled low, and led them across the field toward the stubborn patch. The rest of the crops were green and strong, swaying in the steady breeze, but that corner stood out like a wound. Yellow leaves drooped where corn should have risen tall, and bare soil showed to where seedlings had simply never made it. The men knelt and began their work. They dug neat cores of soil, slipping them into bags, labeling each sample with practice care. They noted the moisture, checked the color, even sniffed the earth as though their senses might reveal something science could not. Eli stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the quiet efficiency of their work. He had no doubt the men knew what they were doing. He had seen their reports before on neighbors' farms when pests or blight had spread, but a part of him felt certain even as they worked that the patch would resist explanation. One of the agents tried to reassure him. "Sometimes it's nothing," he said, "just a trick of drainage or a pocket of soil composition different from the rest. Nothing a little amendment can't fix." Eli gave a small nod, but said nothing. He had heard the same words from his father once, years ago, and from neighbors since. Amendments, adjustments, improvements, none of it had ever worked. Still, he let them finish, let them gather the evidence and promise results. When the report came 2 weeks later, it read as clean as spring water, pH within range, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium all balanced, no sign of toxins, no heavy metals, no residues from pesticides or industry. The agent had underlined the phrase, "no abnormalities detected," as if emphasis might give comfort. Eli read it at his kitchen table, the paper spread out beside his father's ledger, and felt the weight of silence pressing down. If the soil was clean, if nothing was wrong, then why did nothing grow? He walked the patch again that evening, spade in hand, sinking the blade into the earth as the sun lowered. The dirt broke apart easily, dark and crumbly, smelling as it should. He crumbled some between his fingers, letting it fall back through his hand, and could not shake the feeling that it looked no different from the soil just 10 steps away where corn stood shoulder high. The contrast mocked him. Here, life. There, nothing. The earth gave up no secrets. Neighbors asked him later what the tests had shown. He shrugged, unwilling to explain in detail, unwilling to admit that the experts had found nothing at all. It was easier to let them assume some technical matter than to confess the truth, that the land itself refused explanation. At the feed store and at church, whispers grew sharper. If science couldn't name the cause, then perhaps other forces were at work. Eli avoided their eyes, but he could feel the stories shaping around him. That night, he set the report beside the ledger. 2 documents, years apart, both saying the same thing in different ways. His father's pencil scrawl, "North Patch won't take. The county's clean verdict. No abnormalities detected." One spoke from experience, the other from science, yet both left him standing in the same place, uncertain, restless, staring at a field that would not yield. In the silence of his kitchen, Eli pressed his hands flat against the table and knew the question had only grown heavier. If nothing on the surface explained it, then the answer lay deeper, much deeper. The afternoon sun sat high, bleaching the sky until it seemed almost white, the kind of heat that dried sweat before it reached the edge of a man's brow. Eli Parker carried a spade to the north corner, where the soil lay bare again, mocking the green abundance that surrounded it. He had stood over the spot enough times to memorize its stubborn refusal. Each spring he told himself to let it go, to leave it unplanted. But each spring he pressed seed into the dirt again, and each summer the ground betrayed him. Now, with the county's report folded uselessly in his back pocket and his father's ledger still heavy in his mind, he decided that scratching at the surface would no longer do. He pressed the spade in with his boot, deeper than usual, cutting past the soft topsoil into harder earth. The blade bit down, and the ground gave way reluctantly, releasing a smell damp and metallic, different from the sweet loam he was used to. He bent, turned the spade, and lifted. The dirt fell away in clumps, darker than the rest, clinging to the steel. Sweat dampened the back of his shirt. But he kept at it, methodical, digging straight down as though he could pierce the mystery if only he reached far enough. On the fourth thrust, the spade jarred against something solid. The vibration shot up through the handle into his palms, stopping him cold. He braced and tried again, angling the blade to one side, then the other. Each time the same sharp resistance met him, unyielding, but different than stone. Rock carried a rough, steady feel. This was hollow somehow, a sharp knock like striking against the lid of a barrel. He crouched and brushed at the dirt with his hands, fingertips finding the edge of something too smooth to be natural. The sun baked his shoulders as he cleared more soil away, working in widening circles. Slowly, a flat surface revealed itself, rusted and flaking, the color of dried blood. He tapped it with the spade, and the sound echoed faintly metallic and distant, as if the earth itself was ringing back at him. His breath caught in his chest. Wood could rot, stone could fracture, but this was something made, something placed there long before his boots ever walked this field. He sat back on his heels, staring at the outline emerging from the soil. A panel, perhaps, its edge running straighter than any natural seam. His mind raced with explanations. Old farm equipment buried and forgotten? A fuel tank abandoned when the steel plant still ran? He tried to convince himself of such things, but none settled right. Whatever it was, it lay too deep, and its surface carried no familiar markings, only corrosion eating slowly outward like rusted lace. The wind moved gently through the taller crops nearby, but in the patch all was still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Eli wiped his palms on his jeans, leaving streaks of dark soil, and leaned closer. He rapped the surface again, softer this time, and the echo hollowed out beneath him, faint but undeniable. Something was down there, something larger than the spade could uncover. For the first time in his life, the land he had always thought he knew fell foreign beneath his feet. He stood, eyes fixed on the exposed metal, and for a long moment he did nothing at all. The field stretched around him, ordinary in every direction. But here, in this cursed patch, the ground had answered back, and its answer unsettled him more than silence ever had. The sound was sharp and out of place, ringing through the quiet field like a church bell struck in the wrong hour. Eli froze, one hand gripping the spade's handle, the other steadying himself against the ground. The vibration still hummed faintly through the steel shaft, a tremor that seemed to confirm what his ears had heard. He tested again, driving the blade down with measured force. The spade struck the same surface, and again the dull metallic echo rose up, hollow and resonant. Not the solid thud of rock, not the muffled resistance of wood. This was different. This was deliberate. He crouched low, brushing away loose soil with his calloused hands. The dirt clung to his fingers, dark and damp, until a patch of corroded iron came into view, streaked with rust, yet still undeniably whole. He tapped it lightly with the spade, and the sound rolled back beneath him, deeper this time, as though the earth itself carried a hidden chamber. He leaned closer, listening to the silence after the echo faded, a silence heavier than before, as if waiting to see what he would do next. The late afternoon sun pressed down, but Eli barely noticed. His shirt clung to his back. His breath came shallow, and all he could think about was how out of place this metal was. The Parker farm had been worked for generations. Every inch turned over by plow and harrow, every rock hauled to the edges of fields. Nothing like this had ever surfaced. No hint of buried iron just waiting beneath the roots. He tried to tell himself it could be an old tank or scrap dumped years ago, but the thought did not settle. The surface he uncovered was too broad, too smooth, its edges running in straight lines that hinted at construction rather than accident. He widened the hole, pulling soil aside and heaping shovelfuls until more of the iron showed through. Each strike of the spade brought back that same ringing answer, and each time it seemed to echo a little longer, a little deeper. His pulse quickened. He had no reason to feel nervous. Metal was metal. But the sound unsettled him. It was like knocking on a door and hearing the hollow weight of someone on the other side who refused to answer. By the time the sun began to lean toward the horizon, Eli had uncovered a section the size of a wagon lid. The rusted surface stretched flat, the edges disappearing again into the soil on either side. He squatted beside it, running his fingers along the corroded iron, feeling the pitted texture bite against the skin. The ground around him remained barren, lifeless, as if nothing dared root itself above this hidden weight. It was no wonder the crops failed here. Whatever this was, the earth had been guarding it. He sat back, resting his arms on his knees, staring at the faint glow of rust in the fading light. For years he had asked why this patch rejected seed, and now the land had given him an answer in the form of an echo that refused to be ignored. What lay beneath was no stone, no natural fault in the soil. It was something made by hands, set here long before his own. The discovery filled him with both dread and a strange pull, as though the echo had not just lingered in the ground but lodged itself inside his chest. He knew he could not stop now. Whatever waited below wanted to be found. By morning, the whispers had already reached the edge of town. Word carried quick in places where every change in a man's field became fodder for talk, and Eli Parker's patch had always been the subject of curious eyes. Now there was something new to add. The farmer had dug deep, and the ground had rung back at him. By the time Eli returned the hole after breakfast, he noticed the silhouettes first, standing at the fence line where the road bent. 3 men leaned on the rails, hats tipped against the sun, their shoulders bent in the posture of watchers who meant to stay a while. He knew them all. Amos Turner, whose own farm lay a mile to the west, had a voice that carried further than most. Henry Wilkes was beside him, chewing at a toothpick. His squinting eyes narrowed as if suspicion itself lived in his bones. The third was Samuel Wright, younger than the others, but always eager to hear and repeat whatever story was being passed along. They didn't wave when Eli looked their way. They just leaned, their boots hooked against the bottom board, gazes fixed on the patch that for so long had refused life. Eli lowered himself into the hole, spade in hand, determined not to give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Still, their voices carried across the field, soft at first, then louder as the morning breeze shifted. Amos was saying it must be an old fuel tank, buried when the factory still poured waste into back roads. Henry disagreed. Too wide, he said. Too even. He reckoned it might be part of an old cellar, some forgotten building torn down and covered. Samuel, with no excitement, claimed maybe it was a vault, the kind that held more than grain or tools. His words lingered, fed by imagination, because everyone wanted mystery more than they wanted truth. Eli struck the spade again, metal on metal, the sound ringing out into the open air. The men at the fence fell quiet for a moment, the echo carrying across the rows. Then came Henry's voice, low but certain. Nothing good comes out of ground that doesn't grow. Eli paused, the words sinking deeper than he liked. It wasn't that he hadn't thought it himself. It was just hearing aloud that made it harder to push away. When he climbed out to rest his back, the men hadn't moved. Amos called across, asking if he'd found the edge yet. Samuel pressed him. Was it hollow underneath? Did it sound like something bigger? Eli wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, gave no answer, and returned to the hole. He knew what they wanted. A story to carry home, something to repeat at the diner or in the store. But he also knew that once stories left his land, they no longer belonged to him. The sun climbed higher, and still the watchers lingered. They didn't step closer, didn't offer a hand, only their words and their warnings. Eli felt their presence like weight on his shoulders, heavier with each strike of the spade. The field had always been his alone, its silence shared only with wind and soil. Now it had witnesses, and the secret beneath the ground seemed less as discovery and more a spectacle. By noon, he set the spade aside and sat on the edge of the hole. The men were still there, shadows stretching longer behind them, waiting. He drank from his canteen, eyes fixed on the corroded surface below. and for first time, he wondered if maybe Henry was right. Some things buried stayed that way for a reason. Yet even as a thought crossed him, his fingers itched for the spade, because the echo still called, and silence had never been enough. The soil gave way slowly, each stroke of Eli's spade peeling back another layer of time. By now the hole stretched wide enough for him to crouch inside, the earth piled high around the rim in uneven mounds. His hands, raw from digging, trembled with fatigue, yet he could not stop. The iron surface beneath him had grown clearer with every shovelful. What had begun as a faint outline was now a broad panel, its rusted skin flaking in sheets, exposing streaks of darker metal beneath. He brushed it with his gloves, then bare hands, tracing its edge like a blind man reading a secret. The lines were too clean, too deliberate. No stone cut itself into such perfect angles. No rootless slab lay hidden so deep without a story. He leaned closer, the tang of rust filling his nose, metallic and bitter, different from the warm scent of turned earth. It was the smell of something that had not seen air in decades. He tapped it again with the spade. The echo rolled back, low and hollow, a sound that seemed to travel further than the hole itself, as though an empty chamber lay beneath, waiting. The vibration shivered up his arm, lingering longer than it should, until he found himself holding his breath to listen for what followed. But only silence answered. Heavy, waiting silence. The edges began to reveal themselves as he cleared more soil away. They ran in straight lines, crisp despite the corrosion, forming a rectangle that stretched beyond the space he had cleared. He measured it with his eyes, stepping back, and realized it was far larger than he had imagined. Not a tank, not a single piece of scrap, but a structure, a panel belonging to something deeper. The thought sent a chill along his spine, even as sweat soaked his shirt. Eli scraped at the seam with the tip of his spade, careful not to damage what he uncovered. Dirt flaked loose, revealing a thin gap that ran along one edge. He pressed a fingertip into it, feeling the cool bite of metal that resisted even after all these years underground. A panel, a door, something made to be opened, though the earth had long since locked it tight. He pulled his hand back slowly, staring at the rust that now stained his skin. The sun dipped lower, casting the hole in angled shadows. From the fence line, he sensed eyes watching again, neighbors unwilling to come closer, yet unable to stay away. Their shapes were distant, their voices hushed, but Eli felt them pressing against his back, as if waiting for him to name what he had found. He did not look up. The thing beneath him was answer enough. Kneeling, he pressed his palm flat against the panel. The surface was uneven, blistered with rust, but beneath the decay it was solid, unyielding, a boundary between the world he knew and something else entirely. For years the soil had rejected life here, season after season refusing to yield. Now he understood why. This land had not been barren. It had been guarding. Eli climbed out of the hole as dusk settled, his body aching but his mind restless. He stood at the edge, staring down at the rusted surface, the panel that did not belong. The field around him swayed with evening wind, alive and ordinary, but here in this scarred corner, the earth had finally confessed its secret. What lay below was no accident of nature. It was something built, hidden, and waiting, and Eli knew sleep would not come easy until he uncovered more. The panel resisted him at first, as though the earth itself had fused it shut over the years. Eli had gone back to the barn at dawn and fetched the crowbar, its iron length heavy in his grip, its edges worn smooth from decades of use. He climbed into the hole with the tool balanced across his shoulder, the sun still low enough to cast the field in pale light. The rusted surface waited, silent and patient. It seemed faintly visible where it scraped away soil the day before. He set the crowbar into one of the cracks and leaned in with all his weight. The first attempt yielded nothing. The bar slipped, sending him stumbling forward against the metal, the clang ringing sharp in the hollow space. He spat into the dirt, reset his stance, and tried again, muscles straining as he wedged the iron deeper into the seam. This time the panel shifted, just enough to groan in protest. The sound was deep, unnatural, like the strained breath of something waking after a long sleep. Eli paused, chest heaving, sweat already dampening the collar of his shirt, and listened. The silence that followed felt thicker than before, as if the ground was deciding whether to let go. He pressed harder, sweat rolling down his temple. With a sudden crack, the seal broke. A hiss of air escaped from below, sharp and startling, carrying a smell that hit him in the face before he had time to pull back. It was stale, heavy with the weight of years, and tinged with something metallic and bitter. Eli staggered back a step, covering his mouth with his sleeve, eyes watering at the foreign scent. It wasn't rot, not exactly, but it wasn't clean either. It was the smell of a place untouched, a place buried so long that the air itself had grown strange. Crouching again, he peered at the seam, now widened just enough to see the dark line of an opening. The crowbar trembled in his grip as he pried further, widening the gap. The panel shifted grudgingly, rust flaking into the soil. Each movement brought more of that breath from below, escaping like the exhale of a secret finally cornered. Eli coughed, blinked against the sting in his eyes, but kept going. His body screamed at him to stop, to climb out a hole and fill it back in, but his mind was locked on the mystery. At last the gap grew wide enough to glimpse shadow beyond. Not soil, not stone, but emptiness. He lowered his face close, peering into the crack. It was black inside, darker than the night sky, a hollow space that seemed to swallow the morning light. He could feel the cool draft spilling upward against his skin, unnatural against the warmth of the day. His breath quickened, heart hammering loud in his chest. Each beat echoing like the metallic ring had the first time his spade had struck. He sat back on his heels, staring at what he had done. The panel was no longer sealed. The ground had given up its silence, if only by a few inches. Eli wiped his brow, the sleeve of his shirt streaked with rust and dirt, and looked at his hands. They trembled not just from exertion, but from the weight of what lay ahead. He had opened something that had been meant to stay closed. Above him, the wind swept through the taller crops, rustling like distant whispers. The hole remained still, save for the slow, steady hiss of trapped air escaping into the morning. Eli climbed out slowly, crowbar in hand, and stood over the exposed seam. The panel lay wounded, gaping just enough to promise more. He could not see what waited inside, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever secret the earth had been guarding, it had just begun to breathe again. The opening yawned wider with each strained pull, until Eli could push the panel far enough to slip through. He hesitated at the edge, crouched in the dim light of morning, the crowbar still in his grip, his lungs drawing in the strange air rising from below. It felt colder than it should, not just in temperature, but in weight, carrying the stale heaviness of years sealed away. He lowered himself slowly, boots searching for footing until they found the edge of a beam. The hollow beneath greeted him with silence, so complete it made his own breathing sound too loud. The chamber stretched out farther than he expected, his eyes adjusting slowly to the gloom. Timber supports stood at intervals, their surfaces blackened as if burned or eaten away by time. Some leaned at uneasy angles, others held firm, but all bore the look of decades without care. The dirt walls behind them were damp, crumbling in places, as though the earth had been trying to reclaim what it once gave up. The scent was stronger here, rust mixed with old wood, a sharp tang that clung to his throat and reminded him of forgotten barns. As his sight steadied, he noticed shapes stacked along the far wall. Rectangles, uniform in size, lined neatly in rows. Crates. He moved closer, each step stirring dust that rose in faint clouds around his boots. His fingers brushed the nearest one, the wood soft and splintering under his touch. The surface was stamped with faded markings, paint worn so thin that only fragments of letters and numbers remained. He tried to make sense of them, but time had erased their clarity, leaving behind only the ghost of their purpose. Eli crouched low, ran his hand along another crate. The lid was secured with rusted nails, the edges tight against the frame. He tapped it gently, and the hollow reply inside carried to the chamber, a faint rattle suggesting something solid, something heavy. His chest tightened as the sound echoed off the supports, filling the space with an uneasy resonance. Whatever these crates held, they had been hidden with intention. He leaned back against one of the beams, letting the cool air settle over him. His thoughts moved quick, grasping at explanations that slipped through his hands. Could these be remnants of the factories past, chemical stores abandoned when laws grew stricter, or something military, left in haste, forgotten by everyone except the soil that covered it. Yet the careful stacking, the timber supports, the sealed panel, it all spoke of planning, not accident. He wiped his palms on his jeans, feeling the grit cling to his skin. Around him the chamber seemed to breathe with him, the creak of old wood and the faint hiss of disturbed air forming a rhythm that pressed into his ears. He knew he should climb out, leave it be, call someone with authority to take over. But the thought of strangers swarming his land, claiming the discovery as their own, churned his stomach. This was his field, his family's field, marked in ledgers long before these crates ever existed. Eli crouched again, staring at the stack. Dust drifted slowly through the shaft of light spilling from the opening above, dancing in lazy spirals that made the space feel both timeless and fragile. He reached out once more, his fingertips pressing against the warped wood, and whispered to himself in the silence. Whatever this was, it was no longer buried. The land had kept its secret for generations, but now it was his to face and his alone. The light that spilled to the gap above reached just far enough to catch the sides of the nearest crates, illuminating the faded stencils etched into their surfaces. Eli crouched low, wiping a layer of dust from one with the edge of his sleeve, his fingers trembling as the markings came into view. They were letters and numbers, sharp once but now blurred by age, the paint flaking away in uneven patches. He traced along one with his fingertip, feeling the raised grain of the wood beneath. The letters didn't form any words he recognized, just clusters that looked like codes, sequences that carried meaning for someone long gone. On another crate, larger symbols revealed themselves, stark even in their faded condition. Triangles with bold outlines, arrows pointing upward, circles slashed through with diagonal lines. Some resembled warnings, though none matched the farm signs he knew. No clear flammable or toxic. Nothing written plain. Instead, they seemed older, more cryptic, the kind of symbols meant for those already initiated into their language. Eli leaned closer, squinting in the half-dark, and thought he could make out a set of numbers beneath one. 1947, the 7 barely visible, as if the wood itself resisted sharing the date. He stepped back, the crowbar still in his hand, and looked across the rows. Every crate carried something, some mark or message, though each was obscured by time. He imagined the men who had stenciled them, their hands steady, their voices lowered as they worked in secrecy, bearing what they did not want seen. The thought unsettled him. These markings were not casual, not random. They were deliberate warnings meant to endure, though now they whispered in a language no one could fully understand. The chamber seemed smaller with that realization. The timber supports loomed closer, their shadows stretching long across the floor. Dust swirled in the shafts of light, shifting like faint smoke, and Eli felt a pressure in his chest he couldn't quite name. He ran his hand along another crate, finding a faint emblem, an eagle perhaps, or what remained of one. Its wings stretched wide, though the head was gone, worn smooth by years of damp air. Beneath it, numbers again, arranged in neat sequence, though they told him nothing. He sat back on his heels, the cool air of the chamber brushing against his neck. What was hidden here? Ammunition, perhaps, stored away when the war ended? Documents sealed where no one would stumble across them? Or something else entirely? Something the stencils warned about without ever saying aloud? The symbols seemed to taunt him, offering only fragments, never answers. His father's ledger had carried 4 words: North Patch won't take. These crates carried only fragments, warnings half erased, but both spoke the same truth, that the land refused to forget. Eli let his head rest against the nearest beam, closing his eyes for a moment. The silence pressed harder here, the kind that made every shuffle of his boot echo too loudly, every breath a trespass. He felt the weight of the markings even without looking at them, as though the symbols themselves had sunk into the wood and now into the walls of the chamber, waiting for anyone bold or foolish enough to uncover them. When he opened his eyes again, the stencils seemed clearer, more insistent. Warnings without words, numbers without context, letters that led nowhere. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving streaks of dust and rust, and climbed slowly back toward the opening above. The chamber was not empty. It was crowded with messages from the past, and though he could not read them, he understood the intent. Whatever these crates held was not meant for him, nor for any farmer sowing seed in open soil. It had been sealed with purpose, and the earth had tried to keep it that way. The sheriff arrived late in the afternoon, his cruiser crunching across the gravel drive and rolling slow into the field, dust lifting behind the tires. Eli stood near the hole, leaning on his spade, sweat dry on his back, though the air was still warm. He had not wanted to make the call, but the unease had grown too heavy after a sleepless night. The crates were too many, the markings too strange, and the hollow beneath his land felt less like a discovery and more like a burden he couldn't carry alone. Sheriff Lyle Henson climbed out of the car, adjusting his hat as he looked across the field. He was a broad man, older now, with a limp that showed itself when he walked too far. His boots left heavy prints in the dirt as he approached, and his expression shifted from curiosity to discomfort the moment Eli gestured toward the hole. Without a word, Henson stepped closer, peered down into the opening, and exhaled slowly. The faint whistle of breath sounded louder than the wind moving through the stalks. "Well," he muttered, his voice low, "that's something you don't see every day." Eli said nothing, only handed him the crowbar so he could steady himself while leaning forward. The sheriff crouched at the edge, his radio clipped to his shoulder, crackling faintly with distant chatter. He flicked it off with a thumb, leaving the field wrapped in silence again. After a long pause, he stood, brushing his hands on his belt, his jaw working as though the right words might come if he chewed at them long enough. "You're sure you didn't know this was here?" he asked. Eli shook his head, just kept finding dead crops. Dug deeper this time. That's when I hit it. Henson studied him, then glanced back at the hole, his eyes narrowing. He didn't doubt Eli, not exactly, but he looked like a man who wanted to. The sheriff had grown up in this town same as Eli, and he knew how quickly stories traveled. Something buried beneath farmland carried the weight of rumor, and rumor was harder to bury than any crate. He pulled out a notepad, scribbled a few lines, then stopped mid-sentence, staring at the words as if they already troubled him. His radio hissed again, though faint, reminding him he could call it in at any moment. For safety, for protocol, it should be reported higher. Men from the county, maybe even the state, would swarm the place, sealing it off with tape and trucks. But he lingered, hesitating, the pencil resting against the paper without moving. "What's inside them?" he asked. Eli shrugged. "Didn't open one. Just markings. Warnings, maybe. Numbers I don't recognize." The sheriff exhaled again, slower this time, and tapped his notepad against his thigh. "If I make this call," he said, "it won't be yours anymore. You know that, don't you? Folks will come out here, take over, fence it off. You'll be left watching from the road." Eli nodded, though the thought cut sharper than he cared to admit. The land had been in his family for generations, every furrow and fence post marked in his father's hand. To see it turned into a place of officials and strangers felt like betrayal. Yet keeping it secret felt heavier still. The sheriff paced a slow circle near the edge, his boots grinding the soil, the weight of decision clear in his step. His radio hissed again, the voice on the other end asking for his location. Henson hesitated, hand hovering above the button, then lowered it back to his side. He looked at Eli, his face tired, his eyes holding something close to warning. "I'll hold off," he said finally, "for now. But if this goes wrong, if someone gets hurt, it won't just be your burden." He tipped his hat, climbed back into the cruiser, and drove away without another word. Eli stood alone by the hole, the silence thicker than before, broken only by the fading crackle of the sheriff's radio as it disappeared down the road. The first truck arrived just after dusk, its headlights cutting across the Parker farm like search beams, startling the crows from the trees at the edge of the field. Eli had not been told exactly when they would come, only that they would. He had sat on his porch most of the evening, the crowbar resting against the step beside him, watching the last light drain out of the sky. When the low rumble of engines rose from the road, he felt it in his chest before he saw the lights. One truck became two, then three, their tires grinding the gravel and flattening the grass as they pulled toward the north patch. Men climbed out, not locals, not anyone Eli recognized. They wore dark jackets, reflective vests, helmets with mounted lamps. They moved in silence, speaking only in clipped gestures, the kind of coordination that spoke of habit and training. Within minutes, they had set up portable floodlights, their beams harsh and sterile, washing the cursed patch in a brightness it had never known. The rest of the field lay swallowed by night, but here every shadow was burned away. Eli stood at the fence line, his arms folded tight across his chest. He had not been asked to help, not even asked to step closer. His land was his only in name now. The men moved with purpose, lowering winches and ropes into the chamber, their boots grinding into the soil he had turned with his own hands. Each command snapped in low voices, echoed by the clink of chain and the groan of machinery. The first crate emerged slowly, its wooden edges dark with damp, its stenciled markings glowing faintly under the artificial light. The men handled it carefully, as though it carried weight beyond its size. They set on a pallet, wrapped it in heavy canvas, and bound it with straps. Another followed, and then another, the chamber giving up its secrets one by one. The symbols Eli had traced with his own hands now vanished under coverings, swallowed by procedure, leaving nothing but blank shapes. At the far end of the field, neighbors had gathered, drawn by the noise and the light. They stood in small clusters, their faces pale under glow, their voices hushed. No one stepped forward. No one asked questions. They simply watched, as though witnessing something that belonged more to history than to their town. Children clung to their mothers' coats. Men shifted uneasily with hands in their pockets. The sheriff's cruiser parked at the corner with its lights dark. The work went on through the night. Crates rose from the ground, each one greeted with the same mechanical efficiency, the same silence from the watchers at the fence. Eli felt hollow as he stood there, his breath clouding faintly in the cooling air. He wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, to remind them this was his father's field, his field. But the words never formed. He only listened to the hum of the floodlights, the steady groan of machinery, the soft thud of boots moving across the soil. By the time the last crate was lifted and the chamber sealed again, the sky in the east had begun to pale. The trucks were loaded, their engines roaring to life, headlights sweeping once more across the rows of corn that had never known such brightness. The convoy rolled away without farewell, the dust of their passing settling slowly back to earth. Eli remained at the fence, watching until the last red taillight vanished into the distance. Behind him, the neighbors drifted back toward their homes, leaving only trampled grass where they had stood. The patch lay bare under the weakening floodlight glow, scarred and silent, the earth disturbed but empty. What had been buried for generations was gone in a single night, taken by strangers while the town stood mute. Eli gripped the fence post until his knuckles whitened, the truth heavy in his chest. Whatever the ground had guarded, it no longer belonged to him or to anyone here. It was gone, and the land itself seemed poorer for its absence. The first light of morning spread slowly across the valley, soft and gray, pulling shadows out soil. Eli walked the length of the field before the sun had fully risen, his boots sinking into ground that still held the dampness of night. The rows of corn swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the pale light like ribbons of green. But his eyes stayed fixed on the far corner. It was impossible not to. That patch no longer whispered its secret. It shouted its emptiness. Where once the crates had been hidden, only scars remained. The soil was raw and unsettled, overturned in uneven mounds where heavy machinery had clawed at the earth. Tire tracks cut deep grooves across the patch, curving in wide arcs, pressed so hard in the ground that even rain would not smooth them soon. The surface panel he had first uncovered was gone, lifted out along with everything beneath it, leaving a shallow depression where the chamber had been. The neat lines of his field, once steady and familiar, now ended in chaos, a jagged wound carved into the landscape. Eli stopped at the edge, folding his arms across his chest. The quiet was almost unbearable. No engines, no voices, no hiss of floodlights breaking the dark. Only wind and the faint call of a bird in the distance. The silence carried its own weight, pressing down on him harder than the noise of the night before. He crouched, scooping a handful of loose soil, letting it crumble between his fingers. It was damp, darker than the rest, as though it still remembered what had been buried beneath. His neighbors had not returned. Last night they had stood at the fence like sentinels, whispering and staring, but now the road was empty. No one wanted to face the emptiness left behind. No one wanted to admit they had seen something taken from their town, and had done nothing but watch. Eli understood. He too had stood silent. He too had let the land surrender its secret without protest. The ledger's words echoed in his mind. North Patch won't take. His father had written it as a farmer's note, plain and practical, but now Eli wondered if his father had known more. Perhaps he had heard the same metallic echo, seen the same unnatural lines beneath the soil. Perhaps he had chosen not to dig, not to wake what the ground itself had tried to cover. Eli straightened slowly, dust falling from his palms. His father's silence made sense now. The ledger had not been ignorance. It had been restraint. He walked across the patch, each step uneven as his boots sank into the softened earth. The air smelled of rust and diesel, a blend of what had been hidden and what had come to take it away. When he reached the center, he turned in a slow circle, taking in the scar from every angle. It looked less like farmland and more like a grave, disturbed and left open to the sky. No seed would grow here now. Not after this. The soil itself seemed to resist the idea, as though it had given up something vital and was now hollow. Eli lingered until the sun rose fully, burning away the last of the morning haze. The light poured across the field, brightening every stalk, every leaf. But when it reached the patch, it only deepened the contrast, making the scars sharper against the thriving crops around it. He pulled his hat low over his eyes and turned back toward the farmhouse. Behind him, the patch lay bare, stripped of its secret, marked only by the silence of what had been taken and the weight of what remained unseen. The land had spoken, and in the daylight its silence was louder than ever. Eli leaned against the weathered fence post. It stood rough beneath his palm, the grain worn smooth in places from years of use. The field stretched out before him, rows of corn rising steady and green under the morning sun. To anyone passing by on the road, it might have looked like a season promising a strong yield, the kind of field a man could be proud of, but Eli's gaze never lingered on the rows that thrived. His eyes always returned to the corner, to the scar where nothing grew, where the soil lay bare and wounded, refusing even the simplest seed. The men in their trucks had vanished days ago, their floodlights and machinery leaving behind only silence and churned earth. Whatever had been buried beneath his land was gone, crated up, hauled off under canvas wraps and guarded stairs. He had asked no questions, and none had been answered. They hadn't looked at him when they worked, hadn't explained what they were carrying away, as though he were not the owner of the ground they had torn open, but only another bystander. He hadn't stopped them. He told himself there was nothing he could have done, but the truth gnawed at him still. Now the patch lay open to the sky, stripped bare. Rain had fallen once since then, pooling in the grooves left by tire tracks, darkening the soil but not softening it. Birds avoided it. Even weeds that sprouted wild along the fence line gave it a wide berth, roots curling away from the ground, as if the earth itself rejected life. Eli pressed his boot into the dirt and felt no give, only resistance, as though the land had hardened against him. He thought often of his father's ledger. The words circled in pencil, asterisk North Patch won't take asterisk, seemed heavier now, less a farmer's frustration than a warning passed down quietly through the years. Had his father known what was buried there? Had he chosen silence to protect the family, or simply to avoid stirring something best left undisturbed? Eli would never know. That question, like the crates, had been taken from him, carried away into the same silence that now stretched across his fields. Neighbors no longer asked him about the patch. They nodded in passing, their eyes sliding away if conversation lingered too close to the subject. Some had stood at the fence with him the night of the removal, their faces pale in the floodlight glow, but none had spoken since. The story lived unspoken among them, a thing carried in glances, in pauses, in lowered voices. In a small town, silence could be louder than words, and Eli felt his weight every time he walked down Main Street. He remained at the fence long after the sun had climbed high, watching the wind ripple through the corn, the rows bending like waves on a green sea. Only the corner stayed still, untouched, barren. What had been hidden there was gone, but the absence it left was larger than what had been taken. It was not just a patch of soil anymore. It was a question, one that would never leave him. Eli tipped his hat low, his shadow falling long across the earth. The land had given up its secret, but not its meaning. What remained was silence. And in that silence, questions that no harvest could answer